This is the village's HO modular layout. Very nice long layout. Double loops at the end. I believe there are approximately 20 members that are in the HO division. And just like the N scale, this is also run on DCC. Now, when I speak in a moment with one of the members, he's going to explain how DCC works. Very nice layout. And right here we have a section where we have a streetcar that runs around the block. It's all run electrically powered by catenary wires overhead. And here's a freight that's going by right now. And let's move on a little further here. A little bit more industry here. Comes another freight carrying coal. And this is Jim. Jim is the one controlling him. He's chasing down a train right now. But he's the one that's actually controlling the engines. So he's got one of the handheld controllers. Here comes a really slow-moving freight. And great sound effects. Oop, looks like we lost it. Yep. Hey, Jim. You lost your engines. Yep, looks like they uncoupled. So, yep, going around this side. It's a huge, huge layout. Quite a few modules in this. Big crane in their area. Does a lot of unloading off of the docks. Here's Bob.
Yes, sir.
So, Bob.
Yes.
Explain how all this works, all this DCC.
Alrighty. Let me move on over to here a little bit so I'm not quite as close to you as before. Basically what DCC does is it has a power pack that sends the entire amount of current to all the tracks all the time. In the old DC system, that's how you control the train. The more power you gave to the track, the more power the locomotive had. Here the tracks have the entire amount of power all the time. And in our hands we have what is called a controller, and it sends a digital signal from that controller through the wire, through the track, to a locomotive which has in it a decoder. It's a computer chip of a sort. And what happens is you send through that wire, through that track, to that locomotive what you want that locomotive to do. And only this locomotive will recognize that signal, because on your controller you plug in the address of the locomotive that you want to control. So when you send that signal, it will go only to that locomotive, and that locomotive will react to whatever you're asking it to do. Go forward, backward, headlight on, headlight off, bells, whistles, whatever. And so theoretically you could have as many trains as you can handle and take care of on one track at the same time, because you're not controlling the track, you're controlling each individual locomotive. So you can have trains following one another as long as you have enough people to keep an eye on each one of those trains, and has a controller operating that individual locomotive, which is totally different from DC, because there, if you had 3 tracks on the train and you pushed it, they would all run, sometimes at the same speed, sometimes not. The disadvantage to that, of course, could be you can have two trains on the same track being controlled by two different people with a head-on collision. You couldn't do that with DC because they're all trains on that track one direction. With DCC, you can have multiple trains running opposite directions on the same track. So that's one thing you have to be a little more careful of. Of course, you then have to have a locomotive that has that computer chip in it. It's called a decoder. And those decoders, you can buy a lot of engines that already have them in. Some of them just run the locomotive forward, back, and headlights. Other ones have sound, bells, horns, whatever. And so if you buy a locomotive without all that, you know, your basic Bachmann locomotive you can probably get for $75, $80. When you add a decoder into it, it's maybe $25 to $30 more. If you have an old DC locomotive that you want to convert to DCC, you can purchase decoders and either install them in the vehicle yourself or have somebody do it for you. In some cases, it requires a lot of very touchy soldering. So unless you're really good at soldering and following directions, you would probably pay somebody else to do it. If you go down to Mount Dora, to All Aboard South, he very reasonably will sell you a decoder and charge you a minimal fee to install that in your locomotive. So for somebody that has all DC and wants to convert to the DCC system, that would be a route to go as far as the decoders are concerned. Another thing that's, people think that it's really difficult to change from DC to DCC, and it's really not. If you have a layout that has blocks where you turn them off and on and so on for each block so you can control trains individually, what you would do on to change it to DCC is you would strictly just remove your transformer, the two wires that go to the track, and replace it with the two wires that come from your DCC system, and turn all of your blocks on. So then you would have all the power going to all the tracks all the time, and your controller would control the entire layout. You could still, if you wanted to, say you got a train with lights in the passenger cars, and you want to be able to turn those lights off when it's parked on a siding, you could then still turn the block off from your old DC system. But ordinarily, if you pull a train in there and stop it, you don't have to turn it off because you're controlling the locomotive from your remote control unit. And so basically, it's a lot simpler than what some of the instruction books and people make it sound like. You just remove the wires from your transformer and hook them up to your DCC system, turn all your blocks on, have locomotives that have decoders in them or put decoders in them, and you're all set to run on DCC. One more advantage to DCC is like all these turnouts that you have on a layout, you can put another computer chip underneath those. And then you could, from your controller here, push accessory number 1, open or closed, straight or off to the side. And you could do it right from that controller. You don't have to have extra buttons to control those switches. And if you want, you can do what is called a macro, whereby, let's say you're out on the main line and you want to back into a certain area that requires changing 4 turnouts. You can set them up in a macro, where it will do number 1 to the right, number 2 to the left, number 3 to the whatever you set it, and it would then, by pushing the macro at a certain number, it would set all 4 or 5 of those turnouts. So it's really a neat way of doing things. Another thing with DCC is, since you get the first complete amount of current going to tracks all the time, you can just run wires from the track or from the wires going to the track to a building with a light in it. Since you got constant current there, as soon as you turn your system on, you've got lights in your buildings. The only thing you may have to do is, if those lights are too bright, you may have to put a resistor in the line in order to cut that down so you don't burn those lights out. But you can do it directly from your bus line or your wires underneath the table to a light in the building. You don't have to have a separate transformer, you don't have to have separate switches. It makes it really easy to do a lot of your accessories. So that's really the basics of it. It's not that complicated or difficult unless you read the instruction books.
One question.
Sure.
How do you know which engine you're turning on?
Well, when you buy a locomotive with a decoder in it already, they're all set with an address of 3. All of them, when you purchase them, have an address of number 3. So what you do then is, with your controller, you can change that address of your locomotive. Almost everybody looks at the number on the locomotive and changes the address of this locomotive to 2042 because that's the number. Then on your controller, you select locomotive number 2042. Whatever message you send through the wires will be recognized by this locomotive and run this locomotive only.
Very good. Makes it very simple then. Just look at the number on the locomotive and that's what you're doing.
That's right. You punch in locomotive number 2042 and everything that you tell it to do, it will do then, because it will only be sent to that locomotive, or at least only that locomotive will recognize that coding. Okay?
Amazing. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Bob, and have a great day.
Well, thank you. Good luck with it.
Definitely a great layout. And everybody's getting in position so they can start running.